So the next up, we have Eli Hohbach. He's a seasoned account executive at CIH, specializing in servicing agricultural producers across the Midwest. With nearly a decade of experience in the industry, Eli brings a deep understanding of the unique challenges and opportunities facing farmers. He holds a bachelor's degree in finance and real estate with an emphasis on investments from the University of Northern Iowa. Raised in a rural Iowa farming community, Eli has hands-on experience with harvest work and agricultural building construction, giving him a personal connection to the farming community and ability to provide practical advice. So.
Thank you, Zoe. Everyone hear me? Good? Cool. So as Zoe mentioned, my name is Eli Hohbach. I'm an account executive at Commodity and Ingredient Hedging. I've been at the firm for the last 9 years. We work with hog producers like yourselves, also row crop producers, in helping address manage margin, essentially. A colleague of mine, Tim Hughes, actually did the same presentation about 5 years ago in 2020. And since then, I think a lot's changed as far as hog supply agreements go, and as well as the composition of the Lean Hog Index. So just kind of give you guys a little backstory on who CIH is. We're a financial risk management firm for agriculture professionals. We're established back in 1999. Really kind of the formation of CIH happened right around 1998 and the collapse of the hog market. And at the time, there was a few row crop producers that worked with us that also had some groups of hogs that asked us if we could come up with a model to help manage their margin better for their hogs. And since then, the company has grown quite a bit. It's expanded to the point now we have more than 1,000 clients in multiple different industries. Those industries are pretty wide ranging, range from livestock, dairy, grain producers, elevators, processors, grain merchandisers, ethanol producers, soybean crushers, feed mills, food and beverage companies, import and export, as well as financial services. What we'll be reviewing here today is a few different tools that we've come up with over the past 5-6 years. And a lot of these tools were eventually kind of developed with the 2020 in mind. So if we don't lose your attention right away, flashing a 2020 graphic up there, but this is the difference between cutout or price of pork, as well as negotiated hogs to the cash market. You can see in May that relationship got to about $78 of a difference between cutout and negotiated hogs. That led to a very wide disparity in producers' contracts and how they're being paid, whether it's a cash market, a cutout contract, index, or some sort of variation between. It led to a very wide disparity, and then we made some tools to help our producers and our clients view their contracts against their peers. So those tools we'll be reviewing here today would be our cash contract analysis tool. That was more so maybe back in 2018, 2019 when that came along, as well as the USDA Swine contract library. That was more so, I believe, 2020, 21, and then our hog net price distribution, and then finally we'll wrap it up with the CME Lean Hog Index, what that is, why it's important, why it matters to you guys. So getting into the cash contract analysis tool, we're going to be looking at sample operation, 2 different operations. These 2 operations will have different contracts. First operation is going to be 90% of 602 cutout, and operation 2 is going to be the Western Corn Belt plus $3. These operations will use 50,000 head per year. And then we'll also kind of dive into the basis analysis of those 2 contracts, how volatile they are, and then also some scenario and revenue analysis between those 2 contracts as well. So getting into that, we will assume a few different assumptions here. We're going to assume no grade and yield premium, and we're going to assume no sorting, and we're going to assume those pigs go right to the packer out of the door, so no trucking. What you'll see here is 90% of cutout, as well as Western Corn Belt plus 3. This is as of last Friday's values. So Western Corn Belt was just about $5 better than 90% of cutout. And over the last 1 year, the Western Corn Belt cash markets performed about $1.20 better than a 90% of cutout contract. Over the last 3 years, Western Corn Belt has performed about $1.75 better than 90% of cutout. And over the last 5 years, they're actually pretty similar. You'll notice here in January of 2024, you had record-wide packer margins right there, and you had cash market down, in the mid 40s, and you had that that cutout contract paying in the upper 70s. So these are really big, two different contracts as far as packer margin goes and how they perform, which we'll get into here in a bit. On the basis side here, this is the Western Corn Belt +3 cash contract. You'll see that the red line is last year's basis, the dotted line is the average basis over the last 10 years, and then a blue line would be the basis for that contract so far this year. In the left-hand side where that red line is, we're setting new 10-year lows last year on Western Corn Belt cash. So you had the hog market, in the 60s, cash market was down in the 40s. This year it's been polar opposite. Cash market's been really, really strong and has held in there really for the most part throughout the year. The other thing I'd note too is the basis. Look at the y-axis as well as look at the, on the top and the bottom of the y-axis. The top of the axis can be $25 to $30 positive, while at the bottom it can be $20 to $25 negative. So anecdotally, it just kind of looks like there's a lot of volatility in this contract, whereas in this 90% of cutout contract, things are just a little bit smoother than the Western Corn Belt. You do have kind of absolute highs, at 10, 15, 20 bucks, and then you do have absolute lows down around -10 to -15. And for the most part, basis probably is right around zero towards the tail end of the year. On the back end of the hog curve, basis is generally better on 90% of cutout. And if you guys can't see this in the back, I do apologize. I'll do the best I can to verbally describe what I'm going to go through here, but also feel free to come forward. But what we have here is LHI high, LHI low. That stands for Lean Hog Index high, Lean Hog Index low. So in the high, you have the Lean Hog Index is in the top quartile or top 25%. How does that cash contract pay in that scenario? And when LHI low, so that's in the bottom quartile, when the index is in the bottom quartile, about bottom 25%, how does that cash contract pay? And then 602 high and 602 low, so how do those cash contracts pay when cutout is in the top quartile as well as the bottom quartile? And also 602 minus LHI high and 602 minus LHI low, so that's been basically packer margin. So we're taking cutout minus the Lean Hog Index for both those, and they're also comparing one to the top quartile or bottom quartile. And that's probably the biggest difference between these two contracts is in that last two scenarios. So LHI high, when the index is really high, when the markets are really elevated like they are right now, in that scenario, Western Corn Belt would typically pay about 113. 90% of cutout would be right around 101.28. When markets are really depressed and you guys are needing revenue, Western Corn Belt cash market, unfortunately, is going to be about $13 worse than 90% of cutout. Western Corn Belt would pay about $58.36 when the markets are really depressed in the bottom 25%, whereas 90% of cutout would be up towards 72. When cutout's really high, you would think probably the cutout contract would perform better, but it's actually Western Corn Belt. It would be 110.06, whereas 90% of cutout would be right around 102. When cutout's really low, having that cutout contract would actually be about $9 a hundredweight better than Western Corn Belt +3. And then getting into kind of where I think the biggest difference is essentially packer margin. When packer margin is really wide, in other words, when cutout's really elevated relative to the cash market, 90% of cutout would pay $81 in that scenario, while Western Corn Belt would pay about $64, $67. And then when packer margins are really narrow, it's basically vice versa. 90% cutout would be 89.20, whereas Western Corn Belt would be 102.43. So moving into the USDA swine contract library, this was actually created back in 1999, and then finally they made a database for it in 2003. It wasn't until 2018 when we started kind of pulling all those PDFs together and aggregating all the data for our producers to start looking at. And this is on their website here, so you can, the purpose of the swine contract library, I bolded at the very bottom, and, is the swine contract library is intended to aid in the price discovery process and provide equal access to market information for all market participants. They have a bunch of different PDFs on that website of national cash, Eastern Corn Belt, Western Corn Belt for swine pork market formula, negotiated cash, and they have lots of contracts listed in there. We've sorted through those and put it into a database that makes it a lot easier to look at. So this is a snip from the USDA. This is the LMHG-201 report for slaughtered swine for June 16th. You have 5 buckets that producer pigs fall into. I would probably tend to say 4 buckets really, negotiated formula, which is on the right-hand side there. Typically it's confidential. You have negotiated column here, so there'll be a purely cash transaction between a producer and a packer for delivery not more than 14 days. Other market formulas would be swine that are purchased using futures and options as a pricing mechanism. Swine and pork market formula, this is the biggest one. It's basically a producer that has a contract with a packer that references some type of USDA contract, whether that's a cutout, swine and pork market formula, or national cash, or Western Corn Belt cash. And then the other purchase arrangement, those would be your cost plus contracts, as well as like ABF free, any contract that's receiving a premium would get pushed over into other purchase arrangement. So again, this is a snippet from Friday. This is what you're looking at here is the base price distribution. The base price here is along this x-axis. And then this y-axis is the number of contracts that would have that base price as of Friday. So it doesn't tell you necessarily the volume of those pigs, it just tells you how many contracts there are that are paying that base price. So you can kind of see that it's centered right around between 110 to 112. There's some contracts that are up here at 116, 118, some contracts that are down here, like 104, 106. So that was Friday. And going back to our 2 operations, we can plug those contracts into this tool, and producers will get an idea on where that contract is on all the other contracts that are out there. And this is for swine pork market formula. So again, it's for that one specific bucket in the LMHG-201 report. So 90% of cutout would actually be right with the Lean Hog Index. Western Corn Belt was right here. It's hard to read from an angle, but I think right around 114. And then I would guess in between here would be like your blend contracts. A percent of cutout, percent of cash would be right in between. So in summary, what the USDA swine contract library typically will allow us to do is it's mandatory reporting for each unique contract between a packer and a producer. It allows for the transparency of contracts being delivered upon, but it does not report the volume of pigs being delivered against each contract, number of producers on each contract, or which packers are using which contract. To get into the volume side, we'll kind of get into the next tool here, which is our hog net price distribution tool. Here we'll use the LMHG-201 report as well to get a base of understanding. This is for slaughtered swine for June 19th. We have our 5 buckets here once again. And then we have all these quality features here. So we have head count, net price, average carcass weight, and then we have some quality features on the pig. So the LMHG-215 report from the USDA will pull the average net price. So I've labeled all these net prices right here. So that 109.29 is the number that we'll be kind of referencing here. So we have the LMHG-215 report. This is for June 20th as well for slaughtered swine for June 19th. I've blown that up here, so this 109.29 from the 201 report shows up in this 215 report as an average price. You also have 103.42 from other market formula, and then you also have 108.03 from negotiated formula. What's different is you have the amount of head that are in these $2 buckets. So for instance, there were 13,239 pigs that were delivered upon that received $2 more, somewhere between $0 and $2 more between 109.29 to 111.29 for swine and pork market formula. There was also 30,017 pigs that received $2 between $0 and $2 lower than 109.29. So there we can kind of get a better feel for how many, the volume of the pigs that are being marketed on those different purchase types. And then for the swine and pork market formula here, we're looking at this for June. We're also looking at the Western Corn Belt +3 contracts. Again, going back to our operation here. In the center, we have our 109.29, so that's the average price paid for swine and pork market formula pigs. Western Corn Belt +3 would fall into like the third bucket from the right there of the black line. But it's definitely focused right around 109 area where the average net price would be. So that just gives you a look at Friday. This is actually the last 5 years. So Western Corn Belt +3 has been paid roughly $4 a hundredweight more than average 660 times over the last 5 years, while also being paid roughly $6 a hundredweight less than average 424 times over the last 5 years. The 5-year average would actually be about 55 cents negative. So on the last 5 years, that'd actually be about 55 cents below the average net price for swine pork market formula pigs. What I also note from here is the volatility. I mean, look at the axis. You get -20 right here, all the way up to +18 over here. There's sometimes when that contract's really good, and there's also sometimes when that contract's really poor. Looking at 90% of cutout over the last 5 years, the distribution's a lot more centered around 0. It's not quite as wide. On the left-hand side, you have -10. On the right-hand side, you have +12. And it's definitely less volatile. Over the last, it's been paid roughly $4 a hundredweight more than average, 560 times over the last 5 years, also being paid roughly $6 a hundredweight less than average, 432 times over the last 5 years. This is percentile history of this. So this is for swine and pork market formula pigs for the Western Corn Belt, how that contract stacks up relative to all the other contracts that are out there. And right now you got sometimes when it's really good up at the 100th percentile, and you got also sometimes when it's really poor down towards the 0th percentile. You'll notice kind of back here right around January when we had a really wide packer margin, that contract was right around the 5th percentile. Over the last 5 years, it would rank as about the 54.4th percentile as far as contracts go. And then for 90% of cutout, 90% of cutout, it's almost opposite. So when packer margins are really narrow, the cutout contract's not going to be quite as good as other contracts out there. When packer margin's really wide, it's going to be a higher percentile than other contracts. The last 5 years, this contract would be about the 54th percentile on average. And then this is the Lean Hog Index. I generally tend to think of the index as a blend between the two contracts, somewhere in between, kind of a happy medium, not near as volatile. It ranges between the 40th percentile to maybe like the 70th, 80th percentile. And over the last 5 years, it's the 55.4th percentile. So not as volatile as the other two. So what's changed since 2020 in the Lean Hog Index? This is that week of May 9th in 2020. You've got that $78 spread between cutout and cash. What did the composition of the swine pork market formula look like on that day? This is for May 12th of 2020. You had 3 distinct groupings of which pigs were being priced on. The left-hand side of the wider packer margin, you had your cash contracts. Those cash contracts would pay between probably 37 to about 43. You have your cutout contracts on the right-hand side. Those would be $87 to low end. Top end, we're all the way up at 107. And then in the middle would be your blend contracts or your index contracts. So you have 3 distinct categories of how those pigs are being priced. Fast forward the clock to January 11th, week of January 11th, 2024. We also have another wide backer margin, 10-year highs. Not quite as big as the 2020 spread at $78, but this is $40 of difference between cutout and cash. What does swine pork market formula look like now? You don't have those buckets anymore. You don't have those 3 distinct buckets. They're all kind of centered around 64, 66. You still do have some of those down here. It's not quite as much as before, but they're definitely grouped more together. So it does look like over the last 4 to 5 years, producers have probably switched from less cash contracts to more cutout contracts, or more index contracts, or a blend, and the composition of the index has therefore changed over the last 4 to 5 years. So in summary, the hog net price distribution tool, which is the 215 report, it reports within $2 buckets the net price. It's inclusive of discounts and premiums of every producer sold hog process under mandatory reporting, and it allows a producer to compare their price received to their peers on any given day. Finally, we get into the CME Lean Hog Index. What is it? How it's calculated? Why is it important? It's a 2-day weighted average of the following transactions from the LMHE200 report for slaughtered swine: negotiated transactions, swine pork market formula transactions, negotiated formula transactions. Again, negotiated formula most oftentimes is confidential. So the 2 main categories to focus on would be negotiated and swine pork market formula. Swine pork market formula has a lot more head on it than negotiated. Calculation of it, and why is it important? Well, futures settle into the index. LRP, with the increased usage in LRP, also settles against the index. And producers' contracts negotiating our swine pork market formula make up the Lean Hog Index. So I won't read these word for word off of this, but basically this is the snippet from the LMHE200 report. So it's 3 buckets that are being reported there. These are 3 to focus on. Again, negotiated would be cash transaction between producer and packer. Swine pork market formula would be some type of price mechanism where a producer has priced, pigs being priced off of a USDA report, and then negotiated formula. This comes from the CME's website. This is a lot, really small print. We'll get into how to calculate it right here. This is an example actually back in November 4th and November 5th for swine on the 201 report that I threw into Excel. So negotiated would be on the left-hand side here. Swine pork market formula would be on the right-hand side. You have the amount of head being reported for those 2, the carcass weight of those pigs, your total carcass weight, your average net price of those, and then finally get our net total value. The first step is to take your head multiplied by your weight to get a total carcass weight right here. We'll do that for negotiated swine or pork market formula, and then we'll also do it for negotiated formula. Again, negotiated formula is confidential for those 2 days, so we won't pay any attention to it. Then we're going to sum all those weights up to get a total weight of 55.5 million pounds. The next step is to arrive at our value. So we'll take the total carcass weight multiplied by the average net price to get a total value. We'll do that for negotiated swine. We'll do it for swine pork market formula swine. And then we'll do it for negotiated formula. And then we're going to take all those values added up together to get a little over about $5.01 billion. Divide 5.01 by 55.55 million to get $90.24. And that will be the index for November 6th. So the index here, again, this is as of Friday, so this index is 108.78, which is actually below both contracts that we were looking at, 90% cutout as well as the Western Corn Belt cash market. But if you look at the 1-year average, it's 88.20, is right in between these two contracts here. So 9% cutout was 87.70. Western Corn Belt was 88.93. And over the last 3 years, the index would be 87.19. Western Corn Belt was 87.78. Meanwhile, 90% cutout was 86.06. So it's kind of right in between. Also, I'd point your attention here to January of 2024. This green line would be the index. It's right in between those two. So you got 90% cutout in light blue here, and then you got your Western Corn Belt cash down here, and that's right in between. The basis of the index varies as well, except for when futures expire. So there's basically one day in which, if you're priced off of the index, that your basis is zero. It's contract settlement. So that would occur, mid-Feb, mid-April, mid-June, mid-August, mid-October, mid-December. But again, much like cutout, the basis here can range between positive 10, maybe even positive 20, 25. When August goes off, then our basis would be positive, and then a low end, your basis kind of, worst it would maybe get over the last 10 years would be minus 15. So when looking at the base price distribution for swine or pork market formula pigs over the last 3 years, the index is more or less kind of right around the center. So it's the average of all those contracts that are out there. And then looking at the net price distribution tool, the Lean Hog Index over the last 5 years has been between 0 and -2, just about 3,200 times, but it's also been between 0 and +2, about 1,700 to 1,800 times. 5-year average of that would be -54 cents. So again, you guys saw the cutout in the Western Corn Belt and the wide spread on the -20 to +20 or -10 to +10. This is -2 to +2, so it's a lot more stable relative to other contracts. So in summary, hog supply agreements have become more and more complex over the years, especially over the last 4 to 5 years. The USDA does have the information available to you guys, where you guys are to go into them, and you guys are able to view those contracts yourselves. We have tools here to help that process make it a lot easier. Generally speaking, a blended contract between cash and cutout will probably mimic the index a bit more and offer maybe a middle ground for price discovery. The composition of the index has appeared to change, post-COVID. There's not quite as much as the 3 distinct groupings of price discovery. And then contract analysis involves more than just the price. We should also weigh the volatility of the basis, whether we're able to hedge that, and so on and so forth. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor here to any questions if you guys have any.
I guess I'll start. Barrett in the previous presentation really hit home on the importance of your relationship with a risk management rep or a lender. You want to talk a little bit about what makes that relationship successful with a producer, or keys for producers to build that.
Yep. So with CIH, we do have weekly calls with clients, so we're constantly involved in discussions with clients. Looking at fundamentals weekly, what's going on. If there's a big disease break or talks of disease or ASF in China, that's something that would probably, weigh as far as, hey, if margins are really good, which they are right now, is there potential for, the market to get better? Well, that's kind of happens in that conversation where we can kind of structure position differently for that. We also visit outside of the call time as well. And I'd just say communication is probably the most important thing as far as what makes a successful relationship.
So Eli, today, if you're going to analyze how much is cash and how much is cut out of the index? Where would you be on that? Would it be close to 60% cut out, 40% cash?
I mean, it's funny you throw those numbers out. It's probably exactly what I was thinking. Yeah, I would say it's probably the case. Probably more 50 to 60% cut out, 40% cash. And I feel like probably back in 2020 it was probably 70% cash, and 30% cut out.
And that is fluid, though. I mean, it's today's ratio.
It changes, yep. So the composition index would change as more and more producers sign agreements with packers. If you have an existing contract with a packer and that lapses and you sign a new contract, it's a different one, that would have an impact on the index, depending on the size of that contract and how many pigs you have negotiated or committed to it. Would either have more of an impact on it or not, but it does change over time.
You mentioned on the other formula bucket involves a lot of the niche markets, so ABF or some other niche. Wouldn't that potentially always be a higher price, or are those pigs that are priced in a lot of those markets otherwise listed in a cash market?
Those, generally speaking, would be typically a higher price, yeah. They won't have an impact on the index, though.
And why is that? Is that premium taken out of there afterwards, or?
So the index is it's purely just negotiated transactions and swine pork market formula transactions and negotiated formula transactions. I think it is probably because of the premium that you're looking at there. As far as like some producers getting this premium and some not, that has an impact on the index and how if they're hedging or adding features. I mean, a producer's premium probably has a more of an impact on producer B that doesn't receive that. That'd be my guess, but the index is just really those three purchase types.
Doesn't the government report not include trucking, not include premiums, not include matrix or anything like that on those reports?
On the swine pork market formula?
Yeah.
Your grade and yield would be reported on there.
It would be?
Yep.
Okay.
So like that would fall in an average net price. So you have a base price and then you have a net price. And the one that they're pulling data from is the net price. So like your grade and yield actually would be in there, whereas like ABF wouldn't be.
So open pen gestation or ABF premiums wouldn't be in there, therefore they wouldn't affect. And that's why, because they're not in there, right?
Right.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions for Eli? No? Okay. Well, let's give Eli a round of applause and thank him for his time.